Rebecca Collins had dedicated 15 years of her life to the airline industry, building a career that she took immense pride in. As a senior flight attendant for Skylux Airlines, she had cultivated a reputation for professionalism, efficiency, and an unshakable ability to handle the high expectations of first-class passengers. To Rebecca, this wasn't just a job, it was a carefully curated lifestyle. She thrived in the structured world of luxury air travel, where exclusivity and impeccable service were paramount. Every detail, from the crispness of her uniform to the way she poured champagne, was a reflection of the elite experience Skylux promised its wealthiest clients. She had trained herself to anticipate passengers' needs before they voiced them, seamlessly balancing warmth with authority. Over the years, she had encountered every kind of traveler, from demanding executives to eccentric celebrities, and she knew how to cater to each with the right blend of attentiveness and discretion. Her interactions were always polished, her demeanor always poised, and her control over the first-class cabin unquestionable. Rebecca had worked hard to earn her place in an industry where standards were relentless and mistakes were rarely forgiven. She had started as a young, eager flight attendant, willing to prove herself in a world where appearances mattered just as much as service. Through dedication and experience, she had climbed the ranks, eventually securing a coveted position as one of Skylux's senior attendants. With that title came responsibility, the unspoken expectation that she would uphold the airline's brand as one of sophistication and exclusivity. Skylux was not an ordinary airline, it catered to an elite clientele that expected seamless luxury. And Rebecca had mastered the art of delivering it. She knew which passengers required extra attention, who preferred a certain vintage of wine, and even which seats were favored by frequent flyers. She took pride in her ability to manage the delicate balance between professionalism and deference, ensuring that first-class travelers felt not just accommodated but revered. Over the years, Rebecca had developed an instinct for assessing passengers the moment they stepped onto the jet bridge. It wasn't something she consciously acknowledged, but her experience had conditioned her to scan for subtle cues: how they dressed, how they carried themselves, how confidently they handed over their boarding passes. She believed she could tell, almost instantly, who truly belonged in first class and who might have just barely managed to afford the ticket. This silent assessment wasn't rooted in malice, or so she told herself. It was simply part of maintaining the exclusivity that Skylux promised. In her mind, first class wasn't just about the price of the ticket, it was about the experience, the unspoken culture of refinement and elegance that passengers expected and paid for. And as one of the key gatekeepers of that experience, she saw herself as responsible for ensuring that nothing disrupted that carefully crafted atmosphere. Rebecca's pride in her role went beyond serving drinks and adjusting seats. She saw herself as a curator of luxury, someone who helped sustain the illusion that high-altitude travel could be as elegant as a five-star hotel. She knew the power of perception, the weight of expectations, and the unspoken hierarchy that existed even within an airplane cabin. There was an unspoken code among her colleagues. First-class passengers were not just travelers, they were individuals who expected deference, who were used to a certain level of treatment in every aspect of their lives. And Rebecca had spent years perfecting the art of catering to them while maintaining just enough authority to command respect. She wasn't just another flight attendant, she was a master of her craft. Someone who understood the unwritten rules of the luxury travel industry better than most. Her approach to the job had never been questioned, at least not in any meaningful way. She had received commendations from passengers, appreciation from management, and even informal mentorship roles for newer attendants who aspired to reach her level of expertise. Rebecca knew how to command a cabin with a mere glance, how to diffuse tension before it escalated, and how to make passengers feel valued without ever seeming subservient. She had learned the nuances of the wealthy, how to cater to their needs without being intrusive, how to navigate their sometimes unreasonable demands with grace. She understood that in the world of high-end air travel, perception was everything, and she had spent years crafting an image of herself that fit seamlessly into that world. Yet, for all her confidence and experience, there were cracks in Rebecca's perspective that she had never been forced to examine. She believed she was fair, that she treated all passengers with professionalism, but in truth, she had built an unconscious framework of judgment. She had convinced herself that she could determine who belonged in first class and who didn't. And that belief, rooted in years of unchallenged assumptions, was something she had never been forced to confront. Her confidence in her ability to read people had never been seriously questioned. Because up until now, no one had ever truly held a mirror up to her actions. She had spent so many years controlling the first-class experience that she had never considered what might happen if she found herself on the wrong side of it. As she prepared for another routine flight, Rebecca had no idea that her carefully built world was about to be challenged in ways she never anticipated. She had no reason to believe that this flight would be any different from the countless others she had worked over the years. But in just a few short hours, everything she thought she knew about her job, her instincts, and her place in the industry would be turned upside down. James and Camille Johnson arrived at the gate with the quiet confidence of seasoned travelers. Their 2 young children walking calmly beside them. They weren't flashy or loud, nor did they exhibit the kind of ostentatious wealth that some first-class passengers flaunted. Instead, there was a sense of understated elegance about them. James in a tailored navy blue suit. Camille in a modest yet stylish dress that exuded sophistication without demanding attention. Their children, both well-behaved and neatly dressed, clung to their parents' hands, their eyes wide with the excitement of air travel. As they approached the boarding area, their presence caught the attention of Rebecca Collins, who was stationed near the entrance, scanning the passengers as they filtered through. At first, she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was about them that made her pause. Their attire was appropriate, their demeanor polite, yet something about them felt, in her mind, out of place. Rebecca prided herself on her ability to read people, to assess at a glance who was a frequent first-class flyer and who might be new to the experience. It wasn't something she did consciously, at least. That's what she told herself, but years of working with an elite clientele had sharpened her instincts. And something about this family didn't fit the mold of the typical first-class passengers she was used to catering to. She had seen executives, celebrities, dignitaries, and generational wealth pass through her gates, their air of entitlement unmistakable. But the Johnsons carried themselves differently. They weren't seeking validation through expensive accessories or casual arrogance. They simply moved with an ease that suggested they belonged. Even though Rebecca's gut told her otherwise, she barely registered James's warm smile as he handed over their boarding passes. Her eyes flickered to the first-class designation on their tickets, and an inexplicable sense of unease settled in her chest. It wasn't that she believed they were lying. The tickets were real, scanned and verified without issue. Yet, despite the confirmation on her screen, she hesitated. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" she asked, forcing a professional but firm smile. There was no immediate protest, no pushback, only a slight narrowing of James's eyes, a flicker of something unreadable in Camille's composed expression. "Is there a problem?" James asked, his tone calm, but with an underlying edge that suggested he had experienced situations like this before. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the scanner. "I just need to confirm your reservation," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. She didn't add why, didn't offer a real explanation, because even she wasn't entirely sure what had compelled her to stop them. All she knew was that a voice in the back of her mind insisted they didn't belong in the first-class cabin she had spent years meticulously overseeing. Maybe it was the simplicity of their attire, the absence of anything ostentatious to signify wealth. Maybe it was the quiet way they carried themselves, the lack of deference or nervous excitement that some first-time first-class passengers exhibited. Or maybe, though she would never admit it, it was something deeper. Something ingrained in her perception of what wealth and exclusivity were supposed to look like. James and Camille exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. They had dealt with moments like this before. That much was clear, but rather than argue, they simply waited, standing tall, their composure unwavering. Rebecca turned away, moving toward the service desk where a supervisor stood nearby. She pretended to check the system again, knowing full well that their tickets were legitimate. The delay was unnecessary, but it gave her a moment to think, to justify why she felt compelled to challenge them. Behind her, the line of passengers grew restless, a few shifting impatiently as whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she returned, her smile thinner than before. "Follow me," she said, her tone clipped but polite. But instead of leading them toward the front of the plane, where plush first-class seats awaited, she guided them toward the back of the section, near the restrooms. Far from the coveted window seats with the best views. It was a subtle but calculated move, one that sent a clear message. Rebecca wasn't just seating them somewhere different, she was putting them in their place. Camille squeezed her children's hands gently but said nothing. James, too, remained silent, though his jaw tightened slightly as he exchanged another look with his wife. They had faced this kind of treatment before, the passive exclusion. The quiet attempts to make them feel unwelcome. But they weren't here to fight for validation. They were here to take a trip with their children, to enjoy their journey without incident. And so, they took their seats, settling in with a grace that seemed to challenge Rebecca's unspoken assumptions in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the plane continued to board, Rebecca found herself glancing toward them more often than she intended. They weren't making a scene. They weren't demanding special treatment. If anything, they were more composed than some of the executives and socialites she had served in the past. Camille helped one of the children with a coloring book, her expression calm and unbothered. James flipped through a magazine, exuding the same quiet authority he had displayed at the gate. Their presence should have faded into the background, like any other passengers who had settled into their seats. But for some reason, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, that their very existence in first class challenged something she had never questioned about herself before. As the final passengers boarded and the doors prepared to close, another traveler in first class, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, watched the Johnsons with a thoughtful expression. He had noticed what happened at the gate, had seen the way Rebecca hesitated, the way she had deliberately led them to a less desirable section. He said nothing, but his eyes held a knowing look as he glanced between Rebecca and the Johnsons. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. Rebecca, for all her years of experience, suddenly felt the faintest stirrings of unease. She had always prided herself on her control, her ability to manage the first-class experience with precision. But something about this flight, about this family, felt different, and though she didn't know it yet, the decisions she had made in these brief moments at the gate would set into motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about her job, and about the meaning of true authority. Rebecca Collins had always considered herself a fair and professional flight attendant, someone who treated all passengers with courtesy and respect. But as she led the Johnson family away from their rightful first-class seats to the back of the section near the restrooms, she didn't realize that her actions were being dictated by something far more insidious than simple protocol. She had convinced herself that she was simply maintaining the exclusivity and experience that first-class passengers expected. But deep down, an unspoken bias had influenced her decision. Without any logical reason, she had questioned whether James and Camille Johnson truly belonged in first class. Despite their valid tickets and impeccable behavior, there was no policy that required her to verify their credentials beyond the standard check. There was no alert on the system flagging an issue. And yet, she had felt an unexplainable urge to scrutinize them, to subtly push them away from the space that she had worked so hard to curate for what she deemed to be the right kind of passengers. As she settled into her routine, Rebecca found herself repeatedly glancing toward the Johnson family, expecting, perhaps even hoping, to see something that would justify her decision. She told herself that she had acted on instinct, on years of experience reading passengers and anticipating problems before they arose. Maybe they had used points to upgrade, or perhaps there had been some clerical mistake that mistakenly placed them in first class when they were meant to be in economy. Yet, as she observed them, all she saw was a composed, well-mannered family who fit seamlessly into the environment. James sat quietly, reading a book, his posture relaxed but unmistakably confident. Camille kept their children engaged with a small coloring book, her touch gentle but firm. They weren't disruptive, they weren't demanding, they weren't behaving any differently from the wealthy executives and socialites that Rebecca had spent her career catering to. Still, a nagging irritation gnawed at her. It wasn't that they were doing anything wrong, it was that they had accepted their displacement without protest. There was no indignant confrontation, no raised voices demanding to be moved back to their rightful seats. Instead, they settled in with grace, as if they had expected this kind of treatment and had learned long ago not to waste energy fighting it. That realization unsettled Rebecca more than she wanted to admit. She had worked so hard to perfect her authority in the first-class cabin, to ensure that passengers respected the experience she provided. But something about this family's quiet defiance, the way they held themselves with dignity despite the unspoken insult, felt like a direct challenge. Her discomfort only deepened as the flight progressed. Service in first class was typically seamless, with passengers receiving drinks, warm towels, and meals on an impeccably timed schedule. Yet, as the hours passed, Rebecca noticed that she had unconsciously deprioritized the Johnson family. When she went around taking drink orders, she skipped their row and only realized it when she saw Camille pressing the call button after a considerable wait. Even then, Rebecca hesitated before approaching, feeling a reluctant sense of obligation rather than the usual polished hospitality she offered the other passengers. She could tell that Camille had noticed the difference in treatment, but the woman's expression remained unreadable, her tone polite but firm as she requested water for her daughter. Rebecca nodded stiffly and went to retrieve it, though she took longer than necessary before returning. Her colleague, Melissa, noticed the delay and frowned slightly. "Hey, I think they've been waiting a while," she remarked casually. Rebecca brushed it off with a shrug. "We're busy," she said, though in reality, there was no real backlog. Everything was running smoothly, except for her own deliberate choices. The subtle acts of discrimination continued throughout the flight, each one small enough to avoid open confrontation but significant enough to be noticed. When dinner service began, Rebecca ensured that the other passengers received their meals promptly, while the Johnsons were served last. When she walked through the aisle, she barely acknowledged them, though she made friendly conversation with the other first-class travelers. She wasn't outright rude, she was too experienced to let her bias manifest so obviously, but her dismissiveness was intentional. In her mind, they didn't belong, and whether they realized it or not, she wanted them to feel it. What Rebecca failed to consider, however, was that others were watching. Not just Melissa, who had started to pick up on the strange tension in the air, but also a sharply dressed businessman seated a few rows ahead of the Johnsons. He had noticed Rebecca's reluctance to engage with them, the way she conveniently overlooked their needs while tending attentively to the rest of the first-class passengers. He wasn't the type to interfere needlessly, but as the evening wore on, he found himself growing increasingly unsettled by what he was witnessing. Halfway through the meal service, he finally spoke up, flagging down Melissa. He kept his voice low but firm. "I have a question," he said, nodding toward the back row. "Why is it that the family in the last row of first class was served last?" Melissa hesitated, glancing toward Rebecca before responding. "We've just been busy," she said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced by her own excuse. The businessman raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, instead turning back to his meal. But Rebecca had heard him, and for the first time that evening, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. She had spent years controlling the first-class experience, ensuring that everything ran exactly the way she wanted it to. But now, someone else was noticing, someone with influence, someone who wasn't willing to let it slide without question. Rebecca tried to shake off the discomfort, but it lingered as the flight continued. She could feel eyes on her, the awareness of the businessman's observation weighing on her more than she cared to admit. And yet, she still refused to fully acknowledge what was happening. She told herself that she was simply doing her job, that she had no reason to feel guilty. But deep down, she knew better. The Johnsons hadn't done anything wrong. They hadn't demanded special treatment. They had simply expected to be treated like every other first-class passenger, a courtesy Rebecca had deliberately denied them. And whether she wanted to face it or not, that was discrimination. She wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the fact that she had let her bias dictate her actions so easily, or the realization that she was about to face the consequences of it in ways she had never anticipated. From the moment Rebecca Collins had decided to move the Johnson family to the back of the first-class cabin, an invisible barrier had been erected between her and them, one that she maintained through a series of calculated, almost imperceptible choices. She had no intention of outright mistreating them. That would be unprofessional. And Rebecca prided herself on maintaining her reputation as a polished and competent flight attendant. No, what she engaged in was something far more subtle. A quiet exclusion that couldn't easily be pointed to as discrimination, yet sent a clear message nonetheless. It was in the way she prioritized other passengers over them, how her normally warm and attentive service cooled the moment she approached their row. It was in the way she let their needs become afterthoughts, small delays and missed gestures that accumulated over the course of the flight, adding up to an undeniable pattern of disregard. At first, Rebecca had convinced herself that she was simply too busy. After all, first class required a level of attention and precision that demanded efficiency. She moved through the cabin with her usual grace, greeting passengers by name, remembering drink preferences, making sure the right passengers got their preferred seats and blankets. When an older gentleman needed help stowing his bag, she assisted him immediately. When a young woman asked for a different pillow, Rebecca made sure she got one within minutes. But when James Johnson politely requested an extra blanket for his daughter, Rebecca hesitated just a moment longer than she normally would before responding. "I'll see what I can do," she said with a polite but distant nod, moving away without urgency. Minutes passed, and when James pressed the call button, Rebecca took her time finishing another task before heading back to him. "Oh, I'm so sorry for the delay," she said smoothly, retrieving the blanket at last. Her tone was pleasant, professional, but there was no warmth behind it. Camille Johnson noticed the difference immediately. She had traveled enough to recognize when service was being deliberately slow. She had seen the way the attendants rushed to other passengers at the first sign of a raised hand, how they lingered and chatted with the elite travelers, creating an air of familiarity and exclusivity. With them, however, there was distance, a careful, controlled politeness that made it clear they weren't being fully welcomed into the space. Camille didn't comment on it. She never did in situations like this, but when she exchanged a glance with James, he gave her a knowing look. They had both experienced this kind of treatment before. This careful, measured way of being made to feel like they didn't quite belong. The pattern continued throughout the flight. When the first round of drinks was served, Rebecca skipped over the Johnsons' row, attending first to the passengers seated ahead of them. James and Camille waited patiently, not making a fuss, but their delay stood out. By the time Rebecca finally reached them, their choices were more limited than those of the other passengers. "We're out of the Merlot," she said casually when James requested a glass, though he had clearly seen it being served minutes earlier. "Would you like something else?" Her voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable indifference in it. She wasn't rude. Exactly, she was just uninterested, treating them as though they were an obligation rather than valued guests. It didn't stop there. During the meal service, other passengers were offered selections with care, their orders taken with friendly banter and the assurance that their preferences were a priority. But when Rebecca reached the Johnsons, her demeanor subtly shifted. She set their menus down with a little less grace, took their orders without the same attentiveness, and walked away without the customary reassurance of, "I'll make sure it's perfect for you." The difference wasn't obvious enough to cause a scene, but it was there, a quiet dismissal that hung in the air between them. Melissa, Rebecca's colleague, started to pick up on it as well. She had been shadowing Rebecca for months, still learning the nuances of first-class service, and something about the way Rebecca handled the Johnson family didn't sit right with her. At one point, she leaned over to her senior colleague and asked, "Did we run out of Merlot? I thought I saw a few bottles left." Rebecca barely looked at her. "We're low," she said flatly. "Better to save it for the regulars." Melissa frowned but didn't push the issue. Still, as she continued to watch Rebecca interact with the other passengers, she couldn't ignore the pattern forming before her eyes. The Johnsons weren't receiving the same level of service as everyone else, not by much, but just enough to be noticeable. The unspoken nature of Rebecca's bias was what made it so insidious. There was no single moment that could be pointed to as outright discrimination. No explicit act of exclusion. It was in the details, the slight hesitation before acknowledging them, the lack of genuine engagement, the way their requests were handled as secondary concerns rather than priorities. It was the accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant decisions that, when put together, painted a clear picture. Rebecca did not see them as first-class passengers in the same way she saw the others. And yet, what unnerved Rebecca the most was that the Johnsons never called her out on it. They didn't complain or demand better treatment. They simply existed in the space they had paid for, quietly taking note of the way they were being treated but refusing to let it dictate their experience. That composure was unsettling. Rebecca was used to passengers asserting their entitlement, pushing back when they felt their service was anything less than perfect. But James and Camille did none of that. They simply watched, their calm presence a quiet defiance that made Rebecca more uncomfortable than outright anger ever could. As the flight continued, Rebecca found herself growing more restless. Something about this situation felt different. She had seen passengers try to game the system before, had dealt with customers who didn't belong in first class and acted like they deserved special treatment. But the Johnsons weren't like that. They weren't making a scene. They weren't behaving as if they had something to prove. If anything, they carried themselves with more dignity than many of the wealthy travelers Rebecca had served over the years. For the first time, a small doubt crept into her mind. Was she reading this situation wrong? Was she allowing something deeper, something unexamined, to dictate her behavior? The thought was fleeting, quickly dismissed as she focused on her tasks. But it lingered in the back of her mind, a quiet whisper she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. What Rebecca didn't realize was that her actions had not gone unnoticed. Not by Melissa, not by the businessman seated a few rows ahead, and certainly not by James and Camille Johnson. The weight of her subtle biases was beginning to press down on her, whether she was ready to face it or not. Throughout the flight, Rebecca Collins remained largely unaware that her actions had not gone unnoticed. She had convinced herself that her subtle choices, delaying service, offering half-hearted hospitality, and prioritizing other passengers, were too small to draw attention. After all, the Johnsons weren't complaining. They weren't making a scene or demanding to be moved back to the front of first class where they had originally been seated. They sat quietly, exuding a grace that almost unnerved her. But what Rebecca failed to realize was that the very thing that made her comfortable, the idea that her biases could go unchecked, was precisely what was making others uncomfortable. Several first-class passengers had noticed the difference in how the Johnsons were being treated, even if no one had yet said anything outright. The flight was long, and in the stillness of the cabin, details that might have otherwise been overlooked became more apparent. One particular passenger, a middle-aged man dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, had been watching the dynamic unfold with increasing curiosity. He was a frequent traveler, accustomed to first-class service on a variety of airlines, and something about the way Rebecca interacted with the Johnsons stood out to him. At first, he chalked it up to simple oversight, perhaps a busy shift or a mistake in the seating arrangement. But as the flight went on, he saw the repeated instances of delay, the moments where Rebecca's tone with the Johnsons lacked the warmth she gave to others. The way their row was consistently served last. It was too deliberate to be accidental. He observed the way James Johnson held himself, the quiet authority in his posture, the way he exchanged knowing glances with his wife. It was clear to the businessman that James and Camille were aware of what was happening. But they chose not to address it, and that made him wonder, why should they have to? Seated just a few rows ahead, the businessman had seen Rebecca's forced smile as she led the Johnsons toward the back of the first-class section earlier in the evening. He had caught the way she barely acknowledged them afterward, how she moved efficiently from row to row, making conversation with other passengers but offering only the bare minimum when addressing the Johnsons. He noted how other passengers received their drinks promptly, while Camille had to press the call button for a simple request. He could tell that this wasn't a case of simple neglect, this was intentional. Rebecca's service to the Johnsons wasn't overtly hostile, but it was noticeably distant, cold where it was otherwise warm, slow where it was otherwise prompt. It was a kind of exclusion that didn't come with raised voices or outright refusal, but with carefully placed inconveniences that built up over time. The businessman wasn't the only one who had noticed. A few rows back, a woman traveling alone had also observed the pattern. She had been engrossed in her book for much of the flight but had caught snippets of interactions as she sipped her champagne. She had seen Rebecca's hesitation before retrieving a blanket for the Johnsons' daughter and had noticed how the family's meal arrived long after the rest of first class had already begun eating. She found herself glancing at them periodically, wondering if they would say something. But like the businessman, she also understood why they might not. There was a particular exhaustion in having to constantly advocate for oneself in these situations. A weariness that she imagined the Johnsons were all too familiar with. Melissa, the younger flight attendant working alongside Rebecca, was beginning to feel uneasy as well. While she didn't want to challenge her more experienced colleague outright, she couldn't ignore the way Rebecca's demeanor shifted when dealing with the Johnsons. She had already noticed the delay in service, the difference in tone, the way Rebecca had brushed off James's simple request for a drink refill while tending to other passengers without hesitation. Melissa didn't want to overstep, but as she continued to observe Rebecca's interactions, or lack thereof, with the Johnsons, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was the businessman, however, who finally decided to speak up. Halfway through the flight, as Rebecca moved through the cabin collecting empty glasses, he caught her attention with a casual but firm voice. "Excuse me," he said, tilting his whiskey glass slightly in his hand. Rebecca turned, smiling, prepared to offer another drink, but his next words caught her off guard. "I couldn't help but notice that the family in the last row of first class was served quite a bit later than the rest of us. Any particular reason for that?" Rebecca blinked, caught momentarily off guard. She recovered quickly, slipping into the practiced professionalism that had served her well for 15 years. "Oh, we had a bit of a delay in the galley," she said smoothly. "Apologies if it seemed that way, sir." The businessman raised an eyebrow but said nothing right away. He let the silence stretch for a moment before taking a sip of his drink. "A delay in the galley?" he echoed. "Strange, because everyone else seemed to get their meals on time." His voice was calm, his expression unreadable, but his words carried weight. Rebecca felt a flicker of irritation. She didn't like being questioned, especially not in front of other passengers. "I assure you, sir, everything is under control," she said, her voice tight but controlled. The businessman held her gaze for a long moment before offering a slow, knowing nod. "Good," he said simply, "because you never know who might be watching." Rebecca stiffened slightly. There was something in the way he said it that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. It wasn't a direct accusation, but it carried a quiet warning. She nodded quickly, eager to move on, but as she walked away, she felt a wave of discomfort settle over her. Had she been that obvious? Was she imagining things, or had other passengers picked up on the dynamic she had worked so hard to make subtle? She cast a glance toward the Johnsons' row. James was still reading, his face calm and composed, but Camille's eyes flickered toward her for just a second before returning to her daughter. It was a brief moment, but it sent a chill through Rebecca. They knew, they had known the entire time. And worse, so did others. For the first time that evening, doubt crept into Rebecca's mind. She had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining control in first class, ensuring that everything ran according to her expectations. But now, with one simple question from an observant passenger, she felt something shift. The certainty she had carried with her throughout the flight, her belief that her biases were undetectable, that her quiet exclusions would go unnoticed, was beginning to crack. Rebecca took a steadying breath and forced herself to move on, tending to the rest of the passengers as if nothing had happened. But the unease remained, settling into her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. For the first time in years, she felt as though she wasn't the one in control, and she had no idea what that meant for the rest of the flight. James and Camille Johnson had been through situations like this before. It was never blatant, never overt, never the kind of treatment that could be easily proven or called out without seeming overly sensitive. No one had raised their voice at them. No one had told them outright that they didn't belong in first class. But they knew, they always knew. It was in the small details, the extra verification of their tickets, the subtle shift in tone when speaking to them, the delays in service that others did not experience. They recognized it all too well. And yet, as they settled into their seats at the back of the first-class cabin, they remained composed. They didn't argue, didn't demand to be moved back to their rightful seats at the front, didn't cause a scene. They had learned, long ago, that there was power in their silence. Camille adjusted the blanket over her daughter's lap, smoothing it gently while keeping her expression neutral. Her fingers worked methodically, but her mind was elsewhere. She had noticed Rebecca's hesitation at the gate, the way she had scrutinized them just a little too long before asking them to step aside. She had caught the way Rebecca's lips had pressed into a thin line as she scanned their tickets again. Despite the system already confirming their validity, and she had certainly felt the sting of being led toward the least desirable seats in the first-class cabin. Even though their tickets clearly entitled them to better. But Camille didn't react. She had faced this kind of quiet exclusion before, and she had learned that reacting in anger often gave people like Rebecca exactly what they wanted, an excuse to justify their treatment. James, too, had taken everything in. He sat with his book open, though he wasn't reading. Instead, he was thinking. He had watched Rebecca move through the cabin, smiling warmly at other first-class passengers, ensuring their drinks were served promptly, engaging in light conversation with those who expected to be treated like royalty. But when she approached their row, her demeanor cooled. The warmth was replaced with a forced politeness, her service to them feeling more like an obligation than the hospitality she so effortlessly provided to others. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this play out countless times. In restaurants, in hotels, in boardrooms where he was the only black executive in the room. It was an unspoken message, a reminder that no matter how successful he was, no matter how much wealth he had accumulated, there would always be those who saw him as an outsider. As the flight attendants moved through the aisle taking drink orders, James observed as other passengers were served first, their glasses filled with expensive wine and cocktails, their requests met with enthusiasm. Yet when Rebecca finally made her way to their row, the energy was different. "We're out of the Merlot," she said flatly when he requested a glass, though James had seen her pour it for another passenger just moments ago. He held her gaze for a second, reading the barely concealed indifference behind her professional mask. Camille, seated beside him, noticed too. Without missing a beat, James gave a small smile. "That's all right," he said easily. "I'll have water instead." He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing that he saw through her. Camille's fingers rested lightly on his wrist, a silent exchange passing between them. This wasn't new. They had handled worse. They knew what was happening, but they weren't going to let it dictate their experience. Instead, Camille turned to their daughter, flipping to the next page in the coloring book they had brought along. Her son leaned against her shoulder, already drifting into sleep. She glanced around the cabin briefly, noting how the other passengers received effortless attention from the flight crew, how their every need was met with care. But rather than let resentment take hold, she simply inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, her posture never shifting. The businessman seated a few rows ahead continued to watch, his interest in the situation growing. He had seen enough to recognize what was happening, had witnessed the subtle exclusion that was playing out before him. He had expected the Johnsons to push back, to demand the service they had paid for. But they didn't. Instead, they carried themselves with an unshakable dignity that only made Rebecca's behavior look worse in contrast. The more composed they remained, the more glaringly obvious her mistreatment became. As the flight stretched on, James and Camille remained unbothered, or at least, they appeared to be. They spoke softly to one another, shared quiet smiles, and continued tending to their children as if nothing was wrong. But they weren't naive. They knew that every slight, every delay, every forced smile was meant to make them feel out of place. What people like Rebecca never seemed to understand, though, was that they had spent their entire lives navigating spaces where they were underestimated, overlooked, or subtly pushed aside. They had long since learned how to rise above it. At one point, Melissa, the younger flight attendant, approached their row, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry for the delay," she said gently, setting down their meal trays, which had arrived well after everyone else's. Camille met her eyes for a moment, offering a small but knowing smile. "Thank you," she said simply. There was no sarcasm, no bitterness, just calm acceptance. Melissa lingered for a second, as if debating whether to say something more, then quickly moved on. James picked up his fork and took a bite of his food. He chewed thoughtfully before speaking, his voice low enough that only Camille could hear. "They're watching us," he murmured. Camille gave the slightest nod, her expression unreadable. "Let them," she replied, taking a sip of her water. James glanced up briefly, catching the businessman's gaze from a few rows ahead. The man didn't look away. Instead, he offered a slow, deliberate nod, as if to say, I see it too. James turned back to his meal, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He and Camille didn't need to say anything. They didn't need to call Rebecca out or demand better treatment. The truth was already revealing itself. And soon enough, Rebecca would realize that the people she had so easily dismissed weren't just passengers on her flight. They were much more than that. And when the plane landed, she would learn just how wrong she had been. As the flight continued, Rebecca Collins found herself unable to shake a growing sense of unease. She had started the evening confident, sure of her authority in the first-class cabin, as she always was, but something about this flight, something about this family, was gnawing at her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had assumed that once she had led them to the back of the first-class section, subtly removing them from the best seats and finest views, they would either complain or accept their place quietly. But instead, they did neither. They simply existed in the space they had paid for, their calm composure unsettling her more than outright indignation ever could. Rebecca had worked flights where passengers felt entitled, where they demanded attention and personalized service. Yet, the Johnsons were the opposite. They didn't push back when they were served last. They didn't raise their voices when their drink orders were delayed. They didn't roll their eyes or sigh in frustration when Rebecca barely acknowledged them. And somehow, that made her even more uncomfortable. Their silence wasn't submission, it was something else. Something that made her feel like she was being watched. Not just by them, but by the other passengers as well. She wasn't sure when it had started, but she could feel it now, the weight of unseen eyes. The sense that her actions weren't going unnoticed. Melissa, her younger colleague, had been watching her with a strange expression all evening. Though Melissa hadn't outright questioned her, Rebecca could sense the hesitation in her movements, the way she seemed more reluctant to go along with the subtle neglect of the Johnsons. Then there was the businessman a few rows ahead. Rebecca could still feel the lingering weight of his earlier comment. You never know who might be watching. The words had been casual, but they left an unsettling impression. She had brushed it off at first, dismissing him as one of those passengers who liked to involve themselves in matters that didn't concern them. But now, every time she glanced toward him, he was already looking, his expression unreadable yet pointed. Even the other passengers seemed different tonight. Conversations were softer, more reserved. Normally, first-class passengers were in their own worlds, focused on their meals, their drinks, their in-flight entertainment, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet awareness that Rebecca hadn't anticipated. She caught glimpses of exchanged glances, of whispers between passengers as their eyes flickered toward the Johnsons. Were they noticing what was happening? Did they sense the discrepancy in service, the quiet exclusion she had imposed? Rebecca didn't like the feeling. She was used to control, to managing the experience so seamlessly that no one ever questioned her choices. She was the authority in first class, the one who set the tone, who dictated the flow of service. And yet, here she was, feeling unsettled, as though the cabin had taken on a life of its own, one she could no longer direct. She tried to push the discomfort aside, to go about her tasks as usual, but she could feel it creeping in, making her more aware of every interaction. When she passed the Johnsons' row, she realized she was holding her breath, bracing for some kind of confrontation that never came. When she finally brought their delayed meals, Camille simply nodded and said, "Thank you," with a polite smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. James didn't even look at her, simply accepting his plate without a word. It was a small thing, barely even noticeable, but it stung in a way Rebecca didn't expect. It made her feel exposed, as if they knew exactly what she had done and were silently holding her accountable. Her grip on control slipped further when she overheard a quiet conversation between Melissa and another flight attendant near the galley. "I don't know," Melissa was saying, her voice hushed but firm. "It just doesn't sit right with me." Rebecca stiffened. Was Melissa questioning her? The younger woman had never been one to challenge her before, had always followed her lead. But now, there was doubt in her voice. "What doesn't?" the other attendant asked. There was a pause, and then Melissa said, "The way they're being treated. It's different." Rebecca clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep moving before she heard anything more. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew what Melissa was implying. And she didn't like it. Not one bit. By the time the flight had reached its cruising altitude, Rebecca's unease had settled into something heavier. It wasn't guilt, not yet. At least, but it was something close. An awareness that something was slipping through her fingers. Something she couldn't quite name. She had gone into this flight believing that she knew what she was doing. That her instincts were right. But now, as she moved through the aisles, as she caught glimpses of quiet observations, of lingering looks, she started to wonder. Had she miscalculated? For years, she had trusted her ability to read people, to maintain order in her cabin with precision. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had misread something important. That, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one in control. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no idea how this flight was going to end. James Johnson had remained composed throughout the flight, but as the subtle slights and delays continued, he knew it was time to act. He wasn't a man who sought confrontation for its own sake, nor did he believe in making a scene when a problem could be handled with quiet precision. That was something he had learned early in his career. Power wasn't in reacting. It was in knowing when and how to assert oneself. He had spent years in boardrooms negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, carefully assessing when to push forward and when to let people reveal their own biases. And right now, the flight attendant's behavior was revealing more than she probably realized. Leaning slightly toward Camille, he whispered, "I'll be right back." His wife glanced up, her eyes meeting his with an understanding that came from years of shared experiences. She gave a small nod, barely noticeable, before returning her attention to their children. James stood, moving with the same quiet confidence he always carried, and walked toward the front of the plane. He didn't rush, he didn't demand attention. He simply made his way to the galley near the cockpit, where a uniformed crew member stood organizing supplies. The crew member, a young man who looked no older than 30, turned at James's approach. "Sir, can I help you?" he asked politely. "Yes," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with the captain." The request was unusual, but not unheard of. First-class passengers sometimes had reasons to request cockpit access, security concerns, medical emergencies, VIP matters. The crew member hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Give me just a second," he said before disappearing into the cockpit. Inside, Captain Harris sat reviewing the flight's progress with his co-pilot. He was a seasoned pilot, well respected within Skylux Airlines, and known for running his flights with efficiency and professionalism. When the crew member leaned in and whispered something to him, Harris glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly before nodding. Moments later, the cockpit door opened, and James was ushered inside. "Mr. Johnson," Captain Harris said, offering a firm handshake as James stepped forward. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." James accepted the handshake, noting the captain's steady, professional demeanor. He wasn't here to cause trouble, and he made that clear from the outset. "I appreciate your time, Captain," he said, his tone measured. "I wouldn't have requested this meeting if it weren't important." Harris gestured toward the small jump seat near the control panel. "Go ahead and have a seat. What's on your mind?" James sat down, taking a moment before speaking. He was deliberate with his words, choosing them carefully. "My family and I purchased first-class tickets for this flight," he began. "We expected the level of service that comes with that. But from the moment we boarded, it's been clear that we aren't being treated the same as the other first-class passengers." Captain Harris frowned slightly. "Can you be more specific?" James nodded. "We were asked to step aside for an additional ticket check at the gate. Despite having valid first-class boarding passes, once on board, we were seated in the least desirable section of first class, near the restrooms, rather than the front, where we were originally assigned. Since then, we've experienced delayed service, last priority for meals, and noticeably different treatment compared to the other passengers. It's not overt, but it's clear." Harris exhaled, his expression unreadable. He had been flying for decades and had encountered all kinds of in-flight issues, disgruntled passengers, unruly behavior, complaints about service. But this was different. He had heard of situations like this before, ones that spoke to something deeper than simple customer dissatisfaction. "Are you saying you believe this is intentional discrimination?" Harris asked carefully. James met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't need to say it outright. The actions speak for themselves." Harris glanced at his co-pilot. then back at James. He knew that if this was true, it wasn't just a customer service issue, it was a major liability for the airline. Skylux Airlines prided itself on offering a premier experience, and any accusation of discrimination, even if subtle, could be damaging. I assume you haven't spoken to the flight attendant directly? Harris asked. James shook his head. No, that's not my job. I don't need to correct an employee's behavior mid-flight. But I do expect accountability. Captain Harris studied James for a long moment before nodding. He had been with Skylux for years. Long enough to know when a complaint was frivolous and when it carried weight. And something about the way James carried himself, the confidence, the precision in his words, told him that this was not a man who complained without reason. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Harris finally said. I assure you, this will be addressed. James inclined his head slightly. That's all I ask. He rose from his seat, offering another handshake, which Harris returned firmly. Without another word, James left the cockpit, making his way back to his family. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had set something in motion. Rebecca, who had been standing near the galley, stiffened slightly as James walked past her. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her at all. But the way he moved, the way his presence seemed even more commanding now, sent a ripple of unease through her. Something had shifted, and for the first time all evening, Rebecca felt something foreign creep into her chest, doubt. She had assumed control of the situation from the beginning, had believed she could manage the flight as she always did. But the way James carried himself, the way he walked back to his seat with an air of certainty, unsettled her. What had he said? Who had he spoken to? Unbeknownst to Rebecca, her actions were no longer confined to her own judgment. The situation had escalated beyond her, and she had yet to realize just how much her authority was slipping away. As James sat back down beside Camille, she raised an eyebrow slightly. Handled? She asked softly. James simply gave a small nod, reaching for his daughter's hand as she stirred in her sleep. Handled, he confirmed. Camille said nothing, but the hint of a smile ghosted across her lips. She knew her husband well enough to know that whatever happened next, it would be on their terms. The flight wasn't over yet, but the course of the evening had shifted, and Rebecca, whether she knew it or not, was no longer the one in control. As the flight neared its final hour, a quiet tension hung in the first-class cabin. The atmosphere, once filled with soft chatter and the clinking of glasses, had taken on an air of subtle awareness. Rebecca Collins moved through the aisle with forced composure, her usual confidence feeling more like a fragile performance than an unshakable authority. She could sense it now. Something had shifted, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Maybe it was the way the businessman who had questioned her earlier now watched her with quiet scrutiny. Or perhaps it was the lingering presence of James Johnson, seated calmly with his wife and children, exuding the same quiet power that had unsettled her from the beginning. Either way, Rebecca's certainty in how she had handled the flight was starting to crack. She had tried to go about her tasks as if nothing was amiss, collecting empty glasses, checking on the other passengers, ensuring everything looked smooth on the surface. But no matter how much she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting back to James's brief disappearance earlier in the flight. Where had he gone? Who had he spoken to? It wasn't lost on her that, upon his return, there was an unspoken shift in the cabin. He hadn't said anything to her directly, hadn't demanded better treatment or confronted her for her dismissiveness. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set into motion, something that now felt completely out of her control. As she walked past the Johnson family's row once more, her eyes flickered toward them involuntarily. James was scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable, while Camille was gently adjusting the blanket over their sleeping daughter. If they had any lingering frustration over how they had been treated during the flight, they didn't show it, but that, somehow, was worse than if they had. Rebecca would have preferred confrontation, something she could respond to, something that would give her a reason to justify her actions. But their composure left her with nothing to push back against. They weren't making a scene. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were simply there, existing in the space she had tried to make them feel unwelcome in. A soft chime rang overhead, signaling the captain's announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, We are beginning our final descent into Paris. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are secured. The passengers around her began adjusting their belongings, stowing away tablets and shifting in their seats as they prepared for landing. Rebecca used the moment to take a deep breath, trying to steady herself. In a matter of minutes, this flight would be over. She could put it behind her. She could move on. But just as she started to feel a fleeting sense of relief, a flight attendant from the front of the cabin approached her, leaning in with a hushed voice. "The captain wants to see you once we land," she murmured, her tone careful but firm. Rebecca's breath caught. "What?" she whispered back, barely concealing the alarm creeping into her voice. The attendant simply nodded. "He said it's important." Rebecca forced herself to keep her expression neutral, nodding as if this were just another routine instruction. But inside, her mind was racing. She had never been summoned by the captain after a flight before. What could this be about? As the plane touched down on the runway and taxied toward the gate, Rebecca's nerves twisted into knots. She went through the motions, unbuckling her harness in the galley, smoothing down her uniform, preparing to say her usual goodbyes to the first-class passengers as they disembarked. But beneath her polished exterior, a creeping sense of dread was taking root. The passengers began to gather their belongings, slowly filing toward the exit. As James and Camille stood, preparing to leave, James glanced back toward the cabin, his gaze lingering for just a moment before he turned forward again. He didn't say a word to Rebecca, didn't acknowledge her at all. That, more than anything, made her pulse quicken. One by one, the first-class passengers exited, their voices carrying softly as they thanked the crew and stepped into the bright terminal beyond. Rebecca stood near the exit, her hands clasped in front of her, forcing a polite smile as she bid them farewell. But when the businessman in the sharp suit passed her, he paused just slightly, meeting her eyes with a look that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His knowing glance was enough. Finally, the last passenger left, and the doors closed behind them. The cabin was empty now, eerily quiet. Rebecca turned, inhaling sharply before making her way toward the cockpit. With every step, her heels clicked against the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. When she reached the cockpit door, it was already open. Captain Harris was waiting for her, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward the jump seat. "Take a seat, Rebecca," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She obeyed, sitting down with careful movements, her hands tightening around the hem of her skirt. "Is something wrong, Captain?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Harris folded his hands in front of him, studying her for a long moment before finally speaking. "We received a message from corporate," he said evenly. "It concerns the passengers in row 1G and 1H. Rebecca's stomach dropped. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She could feel the blood draining from her face. "The Johnsons," Harris continued, his voice calm but firm, "aren't just passengers, Rebecca. They're the new majority stakeholders of Skylux Airlines." A deafening silence stretched between them. Rebecca could only stare, the weight of his words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Harris exhaled slowly before continuing. "They were conducting an incognito evaluation of our first-class service, and from what I understand, their experience was less than satisfactory." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She felt sick. This couldn't be happening. Harris leaned forward slightly. "They've requested to speak with you before leaving the airport." Rebecca's breath hitched. "Captain, But Harris held up a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. You need to face this." Rebecca. For the first time in 15 years, Rebecca Collins felt truly powerless. The reality of what she had done was no longer just a nagging discomfort in the back of her mind. It was standing before her in the form of undeniable consequences. As she stood to follow Harris out of the cockpit, her legs felt shaky beneath her. The control she had clung to throughout the flight had vanished. And for the first time, she understood, this was no longer her domain. She wasn't the one in charge anymore. Rebecca Collins had spent her entire career believing she was in control. 15 years as a flight attendant had conditioned her to command the first-class cabin with precision, to anticipate the needs of her wealthiest passengers, and to enforce the unspoken hierarchy of luxury air travel. She had prided herself on her instincts, on her ability to recognize who truly belonged in first class and who didn't. But now, as she sat in the cockpit, facing Captain Harris, her world was tilting beneath her. The authority she had relied on so completely was slipping from her grasp. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The Johnsons, Harris said, his voice steady and deliberate, are not just first-class passengers. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, as if to give Rebecca a chance to process them. She sat frozen, unable to breathe, unable to speak. The sinking feeling in her stomach intensified. They're the new majority stakeholders of Skylux Airlines. Harris continued. His eyes remained locked on Rebecca, watching her reaction closely. They recently acquired controlling shares in the company. This flight was one of their first incognito evaluations of our first-class service. Rebecca felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Her chest tightened, her hands clenched in her lap. The very people she had subtly dismissed, had treated with quiet indifference, had worked to make feel unwelcome, were the owners of the airline. This couldn't be real. She scrambled to form a response, to salvage what little control she had left. Captain, I wasn't aware. She managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who they were. Harris' expression didn't soften. And that's the problem, Rebecca, he said. You weren't aware, because you didn't bother to treat them with the same respect as the other passengers. And now, they've formally requested a meeting with you before they leave the airport. Rebecca's breath hitched. A meeting? She echoed, as if saying the words aloud might change their meaning. Harris nodded. Yes, and let me be very clear about something. You need to face this head on. There's no avoiding it. She swallowed hard, nodding mechanically. Her mind raced, grasping for excuses, explanations, anything that could justify the way she had handled the flight. But no justification came. No excuse could erase the choices she had made, the decisions she had so confidently carried out, believing she was simply maintaining the exclusivity of first class. Harris stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Let's go, he said firmly. They're waiting in the VIP lounge. Rebecca's body felt heavy as she rose from the seat, her legs unsteady beneath her. The familiar walls of the first-class cabin, once a space she had commanded with ease, now felt foreign and unforgiving. She walked alongside Harris down the jet bridge, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every step toward the lounge felt like another step toward the inevitable reckoning she had never expected to face. As the glass doors of the VIP lounge slid open with a soft hiss, Rebecca's breath caught. James and Camille Johnson sat comfortably in the plush armchairs of the private space, their presence commanding without effort. They weren't angry, not visibly. At least, there was no shouting, no confrontation waiting for her. But their silence carried more weight than words ever could. James sat with one leg crossed over the other, his expression unreadable as he glanced up at her. Camille sat upright, composed and poised, her gaze steady and unwavering. For the first time in her career, Rebecca felt completely powerless. Captain Harris gestured for her to step inside. Go ahead, he said, his tone neutral but firm. Rebecca hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving forward, forcing herself to meet their eyes. She had spent the entire flight assessing them, questioning whether they truly belonged in first class. Now, she was the one being scrutinized. James studied her for a long moment before speaking. Have a seat, he said simply. Rebecca obeyed, lowering herself into the chair opposite them. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Camille leaned forward slightly, her gaze never breaking. Rebecca, is it? She asked, her voice smooth but cool. Yes, ma'am, Rebecca answered, her voice quieter than she intended. Camille exchanged a brief glance with James before returning her attention to Rebecca. I'd like to start by asking you a simple question, she said. Why do you think we're here? Rebecca opened her mouth, but no words came. She knew what they wanted to hear, but saying it aloud would force her to confront the truth she had spent years avoiding. I understand there were concerns about the service during the flight, she finally said, her voice uncertain. James raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Rebecca swallowed hard. I may have mishandled aspects of your experience, she admitted, each word feeling like it was being pulled from her throat. Camille tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting from unreadable to something resembling disappointment. Mishandled? She repeated. That's an interesting word choice. James exhaled, his tone measured but firm. Rebecca, this isn't just about a slow drink order or seat reassignment. He said, it's about the way you treated us. You didn't see us as first-class passengers. You saw us as people who needed to be questioned, to be scrutinized, to be subtly reminded that we didn't belong. Rebecca's throat tightened. There was no defense against that statement, because it was true. We've been through this before. Camille continued, her voice calm but unwavering. You aren't the first person to treat us this way. And unfortunately, you won't be the last. But what makes this situation different is that we own this airline. And as owners, we have a responsibility to make sure this kind of behavior doesn't happen on our flights. Rebecca felt a sharp pang of regret, deeper than she had expected. She had spent the entire flight believing she was in control, believing that her decisions were justified. But now, sitting across from the very people she had dismissed, she saw herself through their eyes. And she didn't like what she saw. James leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. We're not here to humiliate you, he said, but we are here to hold you accountable. Rebecca nodded stiffly, her hands still clenched together in her lap. She wanted to defend herself, to insist that she hadn't meant any harm. But intent didn't matter, only impact did. The next steps will be handled by corporate. James continued, your actions will be reviewed, and a decision will be made about your future with Skylux Airlines. Rebecca felt her heart sink. She had spent 15 years building her career, believing she was untouchable, but now, the illusion had shattered. Camille stood, smoothing her coat. What happens next is up to you. Rebecca, she said, think about that. And with that, the Johnsons turned and walked away, leaving Rebecca sitting in silence, forced to face the truth that had been there all along. She had never been in control at all. Rebecca Collins had spent years mastering the art of control. As a senior flight attendant, she knew how to command a first-class cabin, how to maintain an air of authority, how to ensure that everything operated exactly as she intended. But as she sat in the plush VIP lounge at Charles de Gaulle Airport, across from James and Camille Johnson, the new majority stakeholders of Skylux Airlines, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Powerless. The meeting room was sleek and modern, designed for executives and high-profile guests. Normally, Rebecca would have appreciated the elegance of the setting, but now the leather chair beneath her felt too firm, the air too still. James and Camille sat across from her, composed and unreadable, their presence alone enough to unravel the carefully maintained confidence she had once carried. They weren't angry, not outwardly. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, and somehow, that made it worse. James rested one arm on the chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of the table. Camille sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Rebecca felt the weight of their silence pressing down on her, forcing her to confront what she had spent the entire flight ignoring. Captain Harris, who had escorted her here, finally spoke, breaking the unbearable stillness. Rebecca, he said evenly, the Johnsons wanted to have a conversation with you before they leave. His tone was professional but firm, offering no room for evasion. Rebecca cleared her throat, forcing herself to meet their eyes. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, she began, her voice more hesitant than she intended. She straightened her shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I understand that there were concerns about the service on the flight. Camille arched an eyebrow, her expression calm but piercing. Concerns? She repeated, her voice smooth yet sharp enough to cut through the space between them. That's one way to put it. Rebecca's hands tightened in her lap. I regret if I made you feel unwelcome. She continued carefully. That was never my intention. James exhaled slowly, exchanging a glance with his wife before turning his attention back to Rebecca. Intention is irrelevant, he said. What matters is what actually happened. His voice was even, but there was a quiet authority in it that made Rebecca feel smaller than she ever had in her career. She swallowed hard, nodding quickly. I see that now, she admitted. I understand that my actions may have come across as, she hesitated, searching for the right word, but Camille supplied it for her. Discriminatory, Camille said plainly. Rebecca flinched, The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. James leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. Let's not dance around this. Rebecca, he said, you saw us. And you made assumptions. You questioned our tickets when you had no reason to. You moved us to a different section of first class, not because of availability, but because of your own bias. You deprioritized our service, whether you realized it or not. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And you expected us not to notice. Rebecca's throat tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't meant to treat them differently, that she had just been following her instincts. But what instincts? Exactly? The realization gnawed at her. Her instincts had told her that a black family in first class required extra scrutiny, that they weren't supposed to belong there. Camille sighed, tilting her head slightly as she regarded Rebecca. Do you have any idea how often we deal with this? She asked, her voice softer now but no less serious. How many times we've been treated as if we need to prove that we deserve to be where we are. Rebecca's gaze dropped for a moment before she forced herself to look back up. I don't, she admitted. It was the truth. She had never given it much thought before. James studied her, his expression unreadable. We could have made a scene, he said. We could have demanded better service. But we didn't. Do you know why? Rebecca shook her head slightly. Camille answered for him. Because we wanted to see if you'd realize what you were doing. If, at any point during that flight, you would recognize how differently you were treating us. She let out a soft breath, shaking her head. But you didn't, even when other passengers noticed. Even when your own colleagues started to question it. You doubled down. And that tells me this isn't just about one flight. This is how you operate. Rebecca's stomach twisted. She had spent so many years believing she was an expert at reading people, at maintaining the perfect first-class experience. But now, sitting in this room, she realized that the person who had truly been misjudging others was herself. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. I was wrong, she admitted. I see that now, and I'm truly sorry. Camille's expression didn't change. Sorry is a start, she said, but the question is, what are you going to do about it? Rebecca hesitated. She had never been forced to confront something like this before. Losing control in the cabin was one thing, but losing control of the very perception she had of herself was something else entirely. James leaned back slightly, studying her. The way we see it. This isn't just about you, he said. It's about the culture of this airline. Skylux prides itself on being a premier luxury experience, and we intend to make sure that experience is the same for every single passenger, regardless of race, background, or anything else. He paused. And right now, based on our experience, that's not the reality. Rebecca nodded slowly, her throat tightening. The weight of what he was saying was clear. This wasn't just about whether she kept her job. This was about something bigger than her. James glanced at Camille before turning back to Rebecca. We're going to corporate with this, he said. Your actions will be reviewed, and decisions will be made. But you need to understand something. Rebecca, he held her gaze, his voice firm but calm. What happens next isn't just about Skylux deciding if you still have a place here. It's about you deciding who you want to be. Rebecca's breath hitched slightly. She had walked into this meeting expecting a reprimand, maybe even termination. But instead, she had been given something far more daunting: accountability. Camille stood first, adjusting the sleek coat draped over her shoulders. We hope this experience teaches you something, she said, because the truth is, Rebecca, you were never the one in control. You just thought you were. With that, James and Camille exited the lounge, leaving Rebecca sitting in silence. For the first time in 15 years, she had no idea what came next. Rebecca Collins sat in silence long after James and Camille Johnson left the VIP lounge, their words still echoing in her mind. The reality of what had just happened settled over her like a crushing weight. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to control the first-class experience, to enforce the unspoken rules of exclusivity and luxury. She had built her entire identity around the belief that she knew exactly how to manage the expectations of high-end travelers. But now, all of that had unraveled. The authority she had once wielded so effortlessly had been stripped away. And for the first time, she was forced to see herself not as the gatekeeper of first-class service, But as the problem, the truth was inescapable. She had misjudged them. She had dismissed them. And she had done it not because of anything they had done, but because of who she had assumed they were. Her breath felt shallow as she stared down at her hands, still trembling slightly in her lap. Captain Harris had remained in the lounge after the Johnsons had gone, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Rebecca," he finally said, his voice quieter than before but no less firm. "Corporate will be in touch soon." Rebecca swallowed hard, nodding, though she could barely process the words. She already knew what was coming. The Johnsons hadn't outright demanded her termination, but their presence alone had ensured that this wouldn't be swept under the rug. They hadn't needed to call for her resignation, they had simply let her own actions speak for themselves. She had spent 15 years climbing the ranks in Skylux Airlines, working tirelessly to maintain her reputation as one of the best flight attendants in the business. She had been praised for her professionalism, for her composure under pressure, for her ability to handle even the most difficult passengers. And yet, none of that mattered now. All it had taken was one flight, one series of choices made with quiet, unconscious bias, to jeopardize everything she had built. Harris exhaled, standing up from his chair. "Take the rest of the week off," he said, his tone making it clear that this wasn't a suggestion. "Use the time to reflect." Reflect. The word stung, as if she hadn't already spent every moment since stepping into this lounge replaying the entire flight in her mind, searching for the exact moment where she had lost control. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just one moment. It was all of it. The moment she had asked the Johnsons to step aside at the gate when their tickets were already valid. The way she had led them to the back of first class instead of the premium seats they had paid for. The way she had delayed their service, deprioritized their comfort, convinced herself that she was simply following procedure when, in reality, she had been following nothing but her own assumptions. Rebecca rose shakily to her feet, forcing herself to keep her head high as she exited the lounge. But as she stepped into the terminal, the weight of everything hit her at once. She had never felt so exposed. It was as if the passengers moving past her, business executives, vacationing families, young professionals rushing to their next flight, could see right through her. As if they all somehow knew what she had done. By the time she reached the employee parking lot, her hands were shaking so badly that she had to grip the steering wheel just to steady herself. She sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the dashboard, her mind replaying the Johnsons' words over and over. "This isn't just about you. It's about the culture we want to create." She had always believed she was a good person. She had never thought of herself as someone who discriminated. And yet, her actions on that flight had told a different story. The realization was suffocating. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She hesitated before glancing at the screen. It was an email from Skylux Corporate. The subject line alone made her stomach turn. "Immediate review of employee conduct, Rebecca Collins." With a shaky exhale, she opened the email, scanning the message quickly. It was direct and to the point. She was being placed on immediate suspension. Pending an internal review, there would be a formal meeting with Hour, during which she would have the opportunity to explain her actions. The final decision regarding her employment would be made after that. Rebecca's grip tightened around the phone. She had known this was coming. And yet, seeing it in writing made it feel final in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Suspension. In all her years with Skylux, she had never even received a complaint, let alone disciplinary action. She had always been the one enforcing standards, ensuring that others upheld the airline's pristine image. But now, she was the one being investigated. And the worst part was, she knew there was no way to defend herself. What was she supposed to say? That she hadn't meant to treat the Johnsons differently? That it hadn't been deliberate? Intent didn't matter. She had built her career on the idea that every detail counted. That even the smallest gestures shaped a passenger's experience. And if she believed that to be true when it came to providing luxury service, then she had to believe it was just as true when it came to exclusion. Rebecca sat in her car, the email still open in her lap, as the full weight of the situation settled over her. She had spent years believing she was in control. But now, as she faced the reality of her suspension, of the very real possibility that she had destroyed her career in a single flight, she realized the truth. She had never been in control at all. Rebecca Collins had spent the past week suspended, waiting for an email or a phone call from Skylux Airlines that would determine her future. Every morning, she woke up with a sense of dread, knowing that her career, the one thing she had spent 15 years building, was hanging by a thread. She had spent the first few days convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, she would be given another chance. After all, she had been one of Skylux's top flight attendants, praised for her professionalism, her ability to handle high-end passengers, her dedication to the airline's reputation. But deep down, she knew the truth. No amount of past accolades could erase what had happened on that flight. She had made a choice, a series of them. Really, and now, she was going to have to face the consequences. When the email finally arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, Rebecca hesitated before opening it. The subject line was simple yet devastating. Decision regarding employment, Rebecca Collins. Her heart pounded as she clicked the message, scanning the lines quickly, her eyes jumping from phrase to phrase, following an internal review. Violation of company policies regarding inclusivity. Failure to uphold Skylux standards. Effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. The finality of the words sent a chill through her. She reread them, as if hoping the meaning might change if she looked at them long enough. But the decision was clear. After 15 years, her career at Skylux Airlines was over. She sat back in her chair, the email still glowing on her screen. As the reality of the situation settled over her, she had always thought of herself as untouchable. She had followed the rules, climbed the ranks, positioned herself as someone who understood what first-class service was supposed to be. And yet, in a single flight, she had proven herself wrong. All the professionalism she had prided herself on had meant nothing when faced with the truth of her own actions. She had treated the Johnsons differently. She had assumed they didn't belong. And worse, she had refused to acknowledge it even when given the chance. She had brushed off their subtle patience, ignored the quiet observations of the businessman in first class, disregarded Melissa's hesitant concern. She had doubled down on her biases without even realizing she was doing it. And now, she was paying the price. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, snapping her out of her daze. A text message from Melissa. I heard. I'm really sorry, Rebecca. Let me know if you want to talk. Rebecca stared at the message for a long time. She appreciated the gesture, but she didn't know what to say. She had spent so much of her career teaching younger flight attendants how to maintain control, how to manage passengers, how to ensure that first class remained an exclusive experience. And now, the very people she had dismissed, Melissa, the businessman, the Johnsons, were the ones who had seen her for who she really was. The silence in her apartment was suffocating. She had nowhere to be, no uniform to put on, no flight schedule dictating her day. For the first time in years, she had no structure, no purpose, and as much as she wanted to push it all away, she couldn't escape the one thought that kept creeping into her mind. Who am I without this job? She had built her entire identity around being a senior flight attendant, around knowing the ins and outs of luxury travel. She had taken pride in her ability to navigate the expectations of the elite, to make passengers feel special, to uphold the unspoken standards of exclusivity. But had she ever stopped to question what those standards truly meant? Had she ever considered what it meant to subtly decide who deserved to be there and who didn't? For the first time, she was forced to confront the reality of what she had done, not just on that flight, but over the course of her entire career. How many passengers had she overlooked? How many quiet acts of bias had she justified as instinct? How many moments had she ignored where someone, like the Johnsons, had been made to feel as though they had to prove they belonged? She exhaled shakily, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, her head in her hands. The regret was overwhelming, but so was something else, something unfamiliar. Awareness. She had spent her career believing she was fair, professional, unbiased, but she hadn't been. She had just never been forced to see it before. The Johnsons hadn't humiliated her, hadn't demanded vengeance, hadn't even raised their voices. They had simply held a mirror up to her actions, and what she had seen reflected back was something she could no longer ignore. Rebecca's gaze drifted back to her laptop screen. The email was still open. The words employment is terminated staring back at her. But there was another sentence near the bottom that she hadn't paid much attention to before. Your termination does not prevent you from seeking further professional development. We encourage you to reflect on this experience and pursue growth in the areas necessary to meet industry standards. It wasn't just corporate jargon, it was a challenge. For the first time, she considered that maybe losing her job wasn't the worst thing that could happen to her. Maybe the worst thing would be refusing to learn from it. She picked up her phone again, hovering over Melissa's message. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she typed back, "I'd like to talk." Maybe she couldn't fix what she had done. But maybe, just maybe, she could start figuring out how to be better. Rebecca Collins had never considered herself the kind of person who needed to change. For 15 years, she had believed she was an exemplary professional, respected, competent, and experienced. She had built her career on the idea that she knew how the world worked, that she understood what it meant to deliver first-class service. But now, sitting in her small apartment, jobless and forced to confront the reality of her actions, she realized something that unsettled her more than losing her career. She had never questioned herself before. She had never paused to ask whether her instincts, the very ones she had prided herself on, were flawed. She had assumed she was fair, assumed she was professional, assumed she treated all passengers equally. But her assumptions had been wrong. And now, she had to figure out what to do about it. Her first few days after receiving her termination email had been spent in a haze of denial, shame, and quiet anger at herself, at the situation, at the fact that she had been blind to her own biases for so long. She had spent hours replaying the flight in her mind, analyzing every choice she had made, the way she had questioned the Johnsons' tickets without reason, the way she had guided them to the back of the first-class section instead of their original premium seats, the way she had deliberately overlooked their needs, convinced she was simply maintaining standards, and the way they had responded, with quiet dignity, with patience, with a self-assuredness that had made her own actions seem so much smaller in comparison. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about that flight. This was about every decision she had made over the years, every unspoken assumption that had influenced how she treated people. It wasn't an isolated mistake, it was a pattern. And if she wanted to move forward, she had to break it. The first step was acknowledging that she didn't have all the answers. That realization alone was harder than she expected. She had spent her entire career teaching others, mentoring younger flight attendants, presenting herself as the expert in first-class service. Now, she was the one who needed guidance. She thought about the Johnsons' words during their meeting, especially Camille's pointed question, "What are you going to do about it?" It wasn't enough to simply feel guilty. She had to act. She started small. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself searching for resources on unconscious bias. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost humiliating, to read about how implicit prejudices shaped decision-making, how even well-intentioned people could make snap judgments that reinforced discrimination. But the more she read, the more she recognized herself in those examples. She had always thought bias was something other people had, people who were openly racist, openly prejudiced. But bias wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was as quiet as a flight attendant deciding that a black family didn't belong in first class. The next step was harder. She reached out to her younger sister, Leah. Their relationship had been strained for years, largely because Leah worked in diversity and inclusion training, a field Rebecca had never taken seriously. In the past, she had dismissed Leah's work as corporate sensitivity nonsense, something that had no real place in her world of high-end service. Now, she needed her help. When Leah picked up the phone, there was a moment of silence before she said, "Rebecca?" Rebecca hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you," she admitted. "I think I finally understand what you've been trying to tell me all these years." Leah didn't respond immediately, but when she did, her voice was softer than Rebecca had expected. "I'm listening." That conversation was the beginning of something new. Leah didn't lecture her, didn't shame her, she simply listened, asked questions, and encouraged Rebecca to dig deeper into why she had acted the way she did. She recommended books, articles, and training courses. She even suggested that Rebecca join a discussion group for professionals who were working to unlearn their biases. At first, Rebecca resisted. The idea of sitting in a group and admitting her mistakes felt unbearable. But eventually, she realized that if she was serious about changing, she couldn't do it alone. She signed up for an online course on workplace bias and inclusivity. The first lesson was about self-awareness, learning to recognize the subconscious prejudices that influenced decision-making. Rebecca had spent years believing she was objective, but as she listened to the course material, she realized just how many of her choices had been shaped by learned assumptions. The idea that first-class passengers have a certain look, the belief that wealth and status were tied to a specific image, the quiet, unspoken rule that some people needed to prove they belonged, while others were accepted without question. For the first time, she saw herself clearly. The journey wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt defensive, moments when she wanted to justify herself, moments when she wanted to walk away and pretend that none of this mattered. But then she would think about the Johnsons, about the way they had handled the situation, with grace, with patience, with a quiet confidence that she had mistaken for entitlement. She would remember the businessman who had called her out, the way Melissa had hesitated when she questioned Rebecca's actions. And she would remind herself that the hardest thing to do wasn't admitting she was wrong, it was committing to change. Months passed, and Rebecca continued her work. She attended seminars, spoke to people with experiences different from her own, and slowly started to reshape the way she saw the world. She even reached out to Melissa, meeting her for coffee to apologize for how she had dismissed her concerns on the flight. Melissa had smiled kindly, saying, "I knew there was more to you than what I saw that day. I'm glad you're proving me right." One day, while browsing online, Rebecca came across a job posting for a training consultant at a company that specialized in customer service inclusivity. She hesitated, then clicked on it. Maybe she wasn't done with the airline industry. Maybe she could take everything she had learned, the good and the bad, and use it to make things better. Maybe, for the first time, she was ready to step into a different kind of leadership. As she filled out the application, she thought back to Camille's question, "What are you going to do about it?" Rebecca finally had an answer. She was going to change. And this time, she would do it the right way. Rebecca Collins had spent most of her life believing that she knew exactly who she was. For 15 years, her identity had been wrapped up in her career as a flight attendant, in the prestige of working for a luxury airline, in the quiet authority she carried as the one who controlled the first-class experience. But now, for the first time in her adult life, she had been forced to ask herself a terrifying question. Who am I without this job? The answer wasn't simple. The woman who had once prided herself on her instincts, who had thought of herself as someone who understood people, had come to realize that she had spent years reinforcing barriers she didn't even know existed. The Johnsons had held up a mirror to her, and what she saw had shaken her to the core. But what mattered now wasn't just that she had seen the truth, it was what she planned to do with it. The months following her termination had been some of the most challenging of her life. At first, she had been consumed by shame, unable to think about what had happened without feeling a deep, sinking guilt. She had spent weeks replaying the flight in her head, thinking about every small decision she had made, every moment where she could have done something different. But eventually, she realized that dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. What mattered was what came next. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could learn from it. And more importantly, she could make sure she never made those mistakes again. Her journey of self-improvement had started with small steps: reading articles, listening to podcasts, taking online courses about unconscious bias and equity in the workplace. She had forced herself to sit with the discomfort of acknowledging her own shortcomings, to confront the biases she had spent so long ignoring. But the real turning point had come when she reconnected with her younger sister, Leah. Their relationship had been distant for years, largely because Rebecca had never taken Leah's work in diversity and inclusion seriously. But now, she needed guidance, and Leah had been willing to give it. Their conversations had been eye-opening. Leah had challenged her, asked her hard questions that forced Rebecca to think in ways she never had before. Why did you assume they didn't belong in first class? What made you hesitate before offering them the same level of service? Would you have questioned their tickets if they looked like someone else? At first, the questions had been painful to answer. But over time, Rebecca had come to appreciate them. They weren't meant to shame her. They were meant to make her better. As she worked through these realizations, something inside her started to shift. She found herself thinking not just about her own experiences, but about the industry as a whole. How many other flight attendants had the same blind spots she had? How many times had passengers like the Johnsons been subtly dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like they didn't belong? And more importantly, what could she do to change that? That question had led her to something she never expected, a new purpose. One afternoon, while scrolling through job listings, she had stumbled upon a company that specialized in customer service inclusivity training. They worked with airlines, hotels, and other luxury service industries, helping staff recognize and correct unconscious bias in their interactions with customers. Rebecca had hesitated before clicking on the posting, unsure if she even had the right to pursue a role in this field. But the more she read, the more she realized that her experience, both her successes and her failures, made her uniquely qualified for it. She had lived this. She had seen firsthand how bias could seep into customer service, how it could shape experiences in ways that were hard to prove but impossible to ignore. And now, she had the opportunity to be part of the solution. Taking a deep breath, she had filled out the application, detailing her years of experience in first-class service, her recent education in diversity and inclusion, and, most importantly, her own personal journey of growth. She had been honest about what had happened, about how she had lost her job and why. She had expected that to be the reason she wouldn't get hired. But instead, it was what made her stand out. When she received the job offer, she had stared at the email for a long time, almost unable to believe it. This wasn't just another job, this was a second chance. A chance to take everything she had learned and use it to help others. A chance to make sure that what had happened on that flight never happened again, not just by her own hand, but by anyone else's. Her first day on the job had been nerve-wracking in a way she hadn't expected. She was no longer the expert in the room, no longer the person who dictated the rules. She was a learner again, working alongside people who had spent years fighting for equity in service industries. But for the first time in her life, she welcomed that feeling. She didn't need to be in control anymore, she needed to listen. As the weeks passed, Rebecca found herself growing in ways she hadn't thought possible. She traveled to airline training programs, speaking to flight attendants about the experiences that had shaped her. She met with hospitality managers, teaching them how small, unconscious decisions could alter a guest's entire experience. She worked with young professionals just entering the industry, helping them see the importance of treating every customer with the dignity they deserved. But more than anything, she had learned to embrace something she had once feared: accountability. She no longer shied away from conversations about what had happened on that flight. Instead, she used it as a teaching moment, an opportunity to show others that growth was possible, that mistakes didn't have to define a person, but refusing to learn from them did. One day, months after she had started her new job, she sat down to write a letter to the Johnsons. She didn't expect them to respond, and she didn't need them to. She just wanted to thank them. "Your actions changed my life," she wrote, "not because you punished me, but because you held me accountable in a way no one else ever had. You forced me to see myself clearly, and because of that, I am a better person today than I was on that flight. I can never undo what happened, but I can make sure it never happens again, not by me, and not by anyone I have the power to influence." As she sealed the letter and set it aside, Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She had once thought that losing her job was the worst thing that could happen to her. But now, she understood the truth. Losing herself would have been worse. And in learning to be better, she had finally found something more meaningful than control. She had found her purpose. Rebecca Collins had spent months rebuilding herself, confronting the uncomfortable truths about her past, and reshaping the way she saw the world. She had lost everything she thought defined her: her prestigious job, her reputation in the airline industry, the sense of control she had once carried so effortlessly. And yet, in losing all of that, she had gained something far more valuable: awareness, humility, and a chance to truly change. Now, as she stood in the lobby of a luxury hotel in New York, preparing to lead a workshop on inclusive customer service, she realized just how far she had come. This was her moment, not of erasing the past, but of using it to create something better. She took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her blazer, her fingers grazing the name tag pinned to her chest. Rebecca Collins, Inclusivity Training Consultant. It was a title she never would have imagined for herself a year ago. A year ago, she had been the senior flight attendant who believed she knew exactly how first-class service should be run. A year ago, she had been the woman who made quiet, calculated choices that excluded people like the Johnsons, never questioning why. A year ago, she would have scoffed at a training like the one she was about to lead, dismissing it as unnecessary. Now, she knew better. As the attendees began filing into the conference room, she felt the familiar nerves creeping in. This was different from her old job, where she had always been in control, effortlessly managing the first-class experience. Now, she was standing in front of people who might have once been just like her, professionals who thought they knew everything about customer service, who believed their instincts were always right. Would they listen? Would they see themselves in her story? Would they understand what she had come to learn the hard way? She cleared her throat and stepped to the front of the room. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady but warm. "My name is Rebecca Collins, and I spent 15 years in the airline industry as a flight attendant. I thought I understood what great service meant. I thought I knew what it meant to treat every customer with respect. But then, one flight changed everything for me." She let the words settle, watching as her audience shifted slightly in their seats. Intrigued, she wasn't going to sugarcoat what had happened. She wasn't going to rewrite the story to make herself look better. She was here to tell the truth. "I lost my job because of the way I treated a family in first class." She continued. "It wasn't an obvious, dramatic act of discrimination. It was subtle. It was the kind of exclusion that's hard to pinpoint, but easy to feel. I questioned their tickets when I had no reason to. I delayed their service. I didn't give them the same warmth and care I gave my other passengers. And I justified it to myself in ways I didn't even realize at the time. But the reality was, I saw them differently. I treated them differently, and I was held accountable for that." A murmur rippled through the room. Rebecca could see the expressions shifting, some skeptical, some uncomfortable, some thoughtful. That was good. Discomfort meant they were thinking. "I spent a long time trying to defend myself, trying to convince myself that I hadn't meant to treat them unfairly," she admitted. "But what I've learned is that intent doesn't matter as much as impact. I thought I was just doing my job, but my actions sent a message, one that told that family, you don't belong here. And that's not just a customer service issue. That's a human issue." She glanced around the room, meeting as many eyes as she could. "I know that many of you have been in customer service for years, maybe even decades. You might be thinking, that could never be me. I thought the same thing. But bias isn't always loud. It's not always obvious. Sometimes, it's in the smallest actions, the ones we don't even question because they feel like second nature. But if we want to be better, if we want to truly provide exceptional service, we have to start questioning ourselves. We have to ask, am I treating every person with the same level of care? Am I making assumptions without realizing it? Am I upholding standards, or am I upholding exclusion?" The room was silent now, the kind of silence that meant people were truly listening. Rebecca felt a surge of something she hadn't expected: purpose. This wasn't just about fixing what she had done in the past. It was about making sure others didn't repeat her mistakes. "I tell you this story not because I'm proud of it," she continued, her voice softer now, "but because I know I'm not the only one who has ever made these mistakes. The difference is, I was forced to see mine. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's why I'm here, not just to help you avoid making the mistakes I did, but to help you create an environment where every person, no matter their background, feels like they belong." She took a deep breath, scanning the room. "So, let's start that conversation. Let's talk about what real inclusivity looks like. Let's talk about how we can make every customer feel valued. Let's talk about how we can be better, not just as professionals, but as people." The room remained quiet for a moment. Then, one by one, hands started to go up. People leaned forward, ready to engage. As Rebecca fielded the first question, she realized something powerful. This was her redemption. Not because she had erased what she had done, but because she had learned from it. Because she had used it to create something meaningful. Because she was no longer the person she had been on that flight, she was someone better. She had once believed that control was the most important part of her job. Now, she understood that true leadership wasn't about control at all. It was about listening. It was about learning. It was about using the lessons of the past to shape a better future. And as she looked out at the room of professionals, all ready to have a conversation she once would have avoided, she knew she had finally found her true purpose. Not as a gatekeeper of exclusivity, but as an advocate for change. In today's world, where diversity and inclusivity are more important than ever, Rebecca Collins' story serves as a powerful lesson. Many of us like to believe we treat everyone fairly, but unconscious bias can creep into our actions in ways we don't even realize. In her case, Rebecca didn't openly discriminate, she didn't refuse service or speak harshly, but her subtle choices still sent a message that the Johnson family didn't belong. Situations like this still happen today. Whether in customer service, workplaces, or everyday interactions, have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? How did it make you feel? This story also raises an important question. What does real accountability look like? Rebecca lost her job, but more importantly, she used that experience to grow and change. She could have made excuses or stayed defensive, but instead, she chose to learn. Do you think her punishment was fair? Should companies take stronger action in cases like this? Or do you believe people should always be given a second chance? Now, imagine you were in Rebecca's position. Maybe not as a flight attendant, but in any situation where you unknowingly made someone feel excluded or unwelcome. How would you handle it? Would you take responsibility like Rebecca did? Or would you react differently? If you were in the Johnsons' shoes, how would you have responded? Let's talk about it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons do you take from this story? Have you ever had a moment of self-reflection that changed the way you see others? Let's have an open and respectful discussion.